The note was still in her hand when Daniel Donovan found her standing in the middle of his barn at midnight, and the look on her face told him everything he had been too afraid to understand for months. Jane Ralston had not meant for him to see it. She had come out here for silence, for cold air, for the particular kind of darkness that did not press against her chest the way the darkness inside the farmhouse did. She had come because she could not sleep, and because the note tucked beneath her pillow was burning a hole through the mattress and through her ribs and through every careful wall she had built around herself since she arrived in Cutter's Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882. She held the folded paper against her chest when she heard his boots on the barn floor. The lantern he carried pushed his shadow long and strange across the hay-strewn ground. Daniel Donovan stopped 6 feet away from her and looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been trying not to want for a very long time. "You read it," he said. It was not a question. Jane's throat tightened. She had not read it, not exactly. She had felt it. She had unfolded it with shaking hands and seen the 8 words written in a child's careful, deliberate print, and those 8 words had broken something inside her that she had not realized was still whole. "Daniel," she said, and her voice came out like a crack in old wood. "Jane." He said her name like a prayer and a warning at the same time. The lantern light moved between them, and somewhere outside a coyote called across the flat Texas dark, and the night felt like a held breath, like a secret pressing against both of them with enormous force. And Jane Ralston thought in that moment that if she was not careful, everything she had been running from would catch up with her right here in this man's barn, surrounded by the smell of hay and horses and something terrifyingly close to home. She had not meant to stay. She had not meant to let any of this happen. She had not meant to fall in love with his land or his life or his youngest child's quiet, relentless faith in her. And she had certainly, absolutely, with every deliberate ounce of herself, not meant to fall in love with him. But the note was in her hand, and he was looking at her, and the truth of the past 4 months was rising up between them like floodwater, and there was nowhere left to run. This is how she had arrived at Daniel Donovan's door. The Galveston stagecoach had dropped Jane Ralston at the junction outside Cutter's Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in early March of 1882. And the town had looked at her the way small towns always look at women traveling alone, with curiosity that had sharp teeth. Jane was 26 years old, which was considered past the comfortable age of marriage by the standards of most Texas counties, and she carried everything she owned in a single leather trunk that had belonged to her mother. She had brown hair that refused to stay pinned neatly, green eyes that people sometimes called too direct, and a manner that the women of Cutter's Creek would later describe, depending on their disposition, as either composed or cold. She had come to Cutter's Creek because of an advertisement, not the kind that women usually answered, with language about ranchers seeking wives and promises of good land and Christian households. The advertisement Jane had answered was placed by a lawyer named Mr. Aldous Prentice, acting on behalf of one Daniel Donovan of the Broken Spur Ranch, 12 miles southeast of Cutter's Creek, who was seeking a governess for his 3 children following the death of their mother 14 months prior. The advertisement had said, "Experience with children preferred, references required, room and board provided, salary modest but fair." It had not mentioned that Daniel Donovan was 34 years old, and looked like he had been carved out of the same hard cedar country as the land he worked. It had not mentioned that he had dark hair gone gray at the temples and blue eyes that saw things clearly and hands that were scarred from honest work. It had not mentioned that he was the kind of man who said very little and meant every word of it. It had also not mentioned his youngest child. Jane had received responses from 2 other ranching families when she'd sent her references, and she had chosen Daniel Donovan's offer because Mr. Prentice's letter had been direct and courteous and had listed the ages of the children without sentiment. Thomas, age 9, Clara, age 7, and the youngest, Eliza, age 5. She had chosen it because she needed to go somewhere no one knew her name and her history, and the particular shape of the betrayal that had driven her out of Austin 6 months before. She had chosen it because the advertisement had asked for a governess and not a wife, and she needed very much to be of use without being claimed. The Broken Spur Ranch was 12 miles of low cedar and caliche flat from the center of Cutter's Creek, and when the hired hand named Hector drove her out in the buckboard on that Tuesday afternoon, the land opened up around her like a sentence with no end. The sky was immense and pale blue, and the mesquite trees were just beginning to show their first nervous leaves, and somewhere over the rise a mockingbird was doing 7 different impressions of birds it had never met. Hector, who was a compact Mexican man of about 50 with a gray mustache and the quiet dignity of someone who had seen considerable history, told her about the ranch in short, factual sentences. 300 head of cattle, a well that had never gone dry, a vegetable garden that Mrs. Donovan had started and the children tried to tend, a barn that needed a new roof on the east side. He did not tell her about Mr. Donovan's grief, but she could feel the shape of it in everything he did not say. Daniel Donovan was standing on the porch of the main house when they arrived, and his 3 children were arranged beside him with the careful posture of children who have been told to make a good impression. Thomas stood straight and serious with his father's blue eyes. Clara stood close to her father's leg, holding a small rag doll and watching Jane with frank suspicion. And Eliza, the youngest, stood at the far end of the porch with her hands clasped behind her back, wearing a dress that was slightly too big and shoes that were slightly too small, and she looked at Jane with an expression of such careful, considered hope that Jane felt it like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. The introductions were brief. Daniel Donovan shook her hand with a firm grip and said he was glad she'd made the journey safely. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who has spent years talking to livestock and land and children who needed reassurance. He showed her the house, which was larger than she had expected, a 2-story frame structure with a wide porch and 4 bedrooms upstairs and a kitchen that was clearly the room the family actually lived in. The furniture was good and worn. There were books on shelves in the front room, which surprised her pleasantly. The kitchen smelled of biscuits and wood smoke, and something floral she couldn't identify until she noticed a small bunch of dried wildflowers in a tin cup on the windowsill, and she thought, from its placement, that it had probably been there since before his wife died. He told her the rules of the household with quiet clarity. The children were to have lessons from 8 until noon. Thomas was working through arithmetic and reading. Clara was beginning her letters properly. Eliza was bright, he said, and then paused, and then said again more carefully, Eliza is very bright, and Jane heard the hidden pride and the hidden worry in equal measure. He showed her to her room, which was the smallest of the 4 upstairs but had a window that looked east over the flat country toward a low line of limestone hills. There was a quilt on the bed in blues and greens, and a washstand with a white pitcher and a small writing desk, and that was all. It is not much, he said, standing in the doorway. It is more than I need, Jane said, and meant it, and he looked at her in a way that made her think he was revising some early assumption about her. He left her to settle in. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the window at the East Hills and told herself this was employment, not a life. She was a governess. She would teach his children and be useful, and she would not think about Austin, and she would not think about what Robert Hale had done, and she would not let herself need anything from this place or these people. She had been telling herself this for approximately 48 hours when Eliza left the first note. Jane had noticed the child watching her in the particular way very small, very perceptive people watch things they are still deciding about. Eliza Donovan was 5 years old, small for her age, with her father's dark hair and her mother's Jane assumed wide brown eyes, and she had a quality of stillness that was unusual in a child that young. She was not unfriendly. She was evaluating. On her 3rd morning at the Broken Spur, Jane woke at dawn to find a folded piece of paper on her pillow beside her head. She had not heard the door. She had not felt the slight depression of small feet on the floor. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was large and crooked and effortful, the handwriting of a child who has been practicing letters but is still negotiating with them. It said, "I am glad you are here because you smell like violets." Jane sat up in bed and held the note and felt something loosen in her chest, some small and carefully maintained tension, like a knot releasing one wrap. She came downstairs to find Eliza sitting at the kitchen table with her porridge, watching the door with the expression of someone waiting for a verdict. Jane sat down across from her and said, "I kept the note." Eliza's expression did not change dramatically. She was not a child given to dramatic expressions. But something in her settled, the way a bird settles after it has decided a branch is trustworthy, and she went back to her porridge. That was the beginning. The notes continued, one every night, slipped under the door or placed on the pillow by tiny hands that moved without sound. Jane began to suspect Eliza was waiting until she could hear Jane breathing deeply before she came in, and the thought of this small child timing her entrance around the rhythm of Jane's sleep made something ache in the center of her chest. The notes were always the same structure. "I am glad you are here because..." And then one small, specific thing. "I am glad you are here because you read the words right. I am glad you are here because you did not tell Papa when I cried at supper. I am glad you are here because you fixed Clara's hair the way she wanted. I am glad you are here because you did not make me feel stupid when I could not remember the number 6. I am glad you are here because when you looked at the moon last night from the porch you looked like you were talking to it." Jane kept every note in the small wooden box she had brought from Austin, the box that had once held letters from Robert Hale, which she had burned the week before she left the city. Now it held Eliza's notes, folded carefully, growing into a small archive of the ways of 5-year-old understood goodness. Daniel Donovan did not know about the notes. This was important to Jane, and she was not entirely sure why. She thought it had something to do with the notes being Eliza's, a private communication between the child and the woman she had decided to trust, and disrupting that privacy felt wrong. She thought it also had something to do with not wanting Daniel to think she was forming attachments. She was the governess. She was here to teach his children. The fact that his youngest child left her notes every night that said one small thing, "She was glad Jane was there," for was a private grace that belonged only to the two of them. Daniel Donovan was not an easy man to know, and Jane was not sure in those first weeks whether he wanted to be known at all. He was present in the mornings and the evenings and scarce in between, the way ranching men are, consumed by the land and the animals and the 100 practical emergencies that constitute the management of 300 head of cattle on the Texas plain. He ate breakfast with his children and he ate supper with them, and in the evenings he sat in the front room with a book or his ledger, while Jane sat with the children at the kitchen table, supervising the completion of their lessons. He spoke to her with courtesy and a certain careful distance that she recognized, because she maintained the same careful distance herself. They were two people managing their respective wounds with the discipline of adults, but sometimes she would look up from where she was reading to the children in the evening and find him in the doorway, watching them, and the expression on his face was something she could not name. Not longing, exactly. More like someone looking at something they had been afraid they would not be able to keep. In April, a month into her time at the Broken Spur, 3 things happened that shifted the arrangement between them. The first was the storm. Texas storms in spring are not polite. The one that arrived on a Wednesday night in the first week of April announced itself at sundown with a sky the color of a bruise and a drop in pressure that made the horses restless and the mockingbirds go silent. Daniel had gone out to secure the barn and Hector had gone to check the cattle pasture fencing, and Jane was upstairs with the 3 children when the wind came in from the northwest like something furious and deliberate. Thomas took the first crack of thunder with studied calm, because he was 9 and trying very hard to be the man his father expected. Clara gripped her rag doll and pressed against Jane's arm. Eliza did not make a sound, but Jane felt the small body climb into her lap with the confidence of a creature that has decided where it is safe, and Jane put her arm around her without thinking and felt Eliza's breathing slow against her chest. The storm lasted 3 hours. The electricity of it, the immense raw power of that Texas weather, had a way of stripping away pretense, and by the time it had settled into steady rain, Jane was sitting on the upstairs landing with all 3 children pressed around her, and she had told them 3 stories, one about a princess who could speak to horses, one about a cartographer who mapped invisible rivers, and one about a woman who found a hidden valley by following a blue bird. Stories she had not told anyone since she used to tell them to the children she had taught in Austin, before everything had come apart. Daniel came in from the barn soaked through, and found them on the landing, and the expression on his face when he saw his 3 children settled into the space around Jane like small satellites around a planet was a thing so unguarded that Jane felt she was seeing something she had not been meant to see. He looked at her over the children's heads and said, "Thank you," 2 words. But they carried the weight of a man who had been managing alone for 14 months, and she felt them in her chest long after the storm cleared. The second thing was the discovery of her history, not her full history, not the part she was most afraid of, but enough. Cutter's Creek was the size of town where everyone knew who everyone was receiving mail from, and when Jane received a letter from her former employer in Austin, a Mrs. Frederica Hale, the postmaster mentioned it to his wife, who mentioned it to 2 other women. And by the time the gossip reached the Broken Spur, it had acquired the specific distortions of whisper chain information. What was said was that Jane Ralston had been dismissed from a prominent Austin family under unclear circumstances. What was also said, in lower voices, was that the family in question was the Hales, and that Robert Hale was known to be a man who made certain kinds of trouble. Millicent Carver, the wife of the neighboring rancher, came to call on a Thursday afternoon with a pie and information she believed it was her duty to share. Jane heard her in the front parlor with Daniel, speaking in the lowered voice of someone who wants to seem reluctant but is not. Jane did not stay to listen. She went out to the vegetable garden and pulled weeds with more force than the weeds required, until her hands were dirty, and the anger in her chest had quieted enough that she could think clearly. She expected Daniel to come to her that evening with questions. She had prepared herself for the conversation, the explanation, the careful accounting of what Robert Hale had done, and how she had left, and why she had not been able to explain it to anyone without becoming the woman who was either believed and pitied or disbelieved and ruined. But Daniel did not come to her that evening with questions. He came to the kitchen after supper when the children were in bed, and he set 2 cups of coffee on the table and sat down across from her and said, "Millicent Carver came by today." "I know," Jane said. He wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at the table for a moment, and then he looked at her. "I told her I hired you because Mr. Prentice recommended you and your references were sound, and that was the end of my concern." Jane looked at him. "I also told her," he continued, with a quietness that had iron in it, "that if I heard she was spreading stories about someone in my household, she would find me considerably less neighborly than I've been." Jane was quiet for a long moment. Her throat felt unexpectedly tight. "You did not ask me what the circumstances were," she said. "No," he said. "Why not?" He looked at her steadily. "Because what I've seen in this house since you arrived is enough." She looked down at her coffee. She thought she might say something about Robert Hale, about what he had done, about how he had used his position and his wife's trust and Jane's own desperate need for secure employment to put her in a situation that left her with no safe exit, only the forced choice between her pride and her livelihood. But the words did not come, and Daniel did not press them, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was, unexpectedly, the most comfortable silence Jane had sat in for a very long time. She said, "Thank you." He said, You do not have to thank me for basic decency." She looked at him then, and he was looking at her, and there was something in his blue eyes that was not the careful distance she had grown used to. There was something warmer and more dangerous than that, and she felt it like the first warm day after winter, welcome and a little frightening. She looked back at her coffee. He looked back at his. They sat there for another half-hour without speaking, and it was the most honest conversation Jane Ralston had had in over a year. The third thing that happened in April was that Daniel asked her to stay beyond the original 6 months of the contract. He mentioned it the way he mentioned most practical matters, directly and without sentiment, standing by the corral fence on a Sunday evening while Thomas tried to teach Clara how to whistle. "I know the arrangement was through the end of summer," he said. "I'd like to ask if you'd consider staying on through the year. The children are better, Eliza especially." He paused. "I'd increase the salary." Jane watched Thomas's patient instruction and Clara's fierce determination, and she felt Eliza standing beside her, small and warm, having arrived at Jane's side at some point without announcement, as was her custom. "I will think on it," Jane said. She did think on it. She thought on it for 4 days, and what she was really thinking about was not the salary or the contract terms, but the way she had begun to feel the contours of this place around her like something fitted to her specific dimensions. She was thinking about the east window and the morning light, and the vegetable garden where she had started planting her own rows, and the kitchen table where the children's reading was getting better and better, and the evenings in the front room that she and Daniel had begun to share with increasing frequency and decreasing formality. She was thinking about the notes. On a Tuesday evening, she told Daniel she would stay through the year. He nodded, as if this was the expected practical outcome of a practical decision. But he turned back to the corral fence after he nodded, and she thought she could see something ease across his shoulders, the way a man's body eases when he has been holding himself in careful tension for a very long time. Eliza, that night, left a note that said, "I am glad you are here because now I know you will not be gone when morning comes." Jane sat in bed with that note for a long time and was not at all certain she was doing the right thing in staying, and was not at all certain she could do anything else. It came in warm and goldenrod, and with it came the situation that exposed the dark past Jane had been carrying and put both her and Daniel in real danger. His name was Clement Hale. He was Robert Hale's younger brother, and he had arrived in Cutter's Creek on the first Thursday of May looking for Jane Ralston. The shape of his arrival was clear in the way he asked questions and the specific people he asked them of: the postmaster, the lawyer Mr. Prentice, the woman who ran the dry goods store. He was building a map. Jane heard about him from Hector, who had been in town for supplies and had sharp ears and sharper instincts. "A man from Austin," Hector told her, quiet and careful while she was hanging laundry, "asking about you by name, well-dressed, mean around the eyes." Jane felt the fear move through her like cold water. She had known this was possible. Robert Hale was a man who did not accept that he had been escaped from. She had left Austin without completing the legal process that his wife Frederica had been building, the testimony about his behavior toward the women in his employ. Jane had been the primary witness. Without her, Frederica's case was weaker. Clement Hale had come to bring her back, or to frighten her into silence, depending on which served his brother better. She did not tell Daniel that evening. She told herself she was still deciding what to do, but what she was really doing was protecting herself against the exposure. To tell Daniel was to tell him everything, to unseal the hidden story she had managed until now to keep at a careful distance. She was afraid that telling him would change his face, would put something between them that could not be removed. She went to bed and found Eliza's note. "I am glad you are here because you made the soup tonight, and it tasted the way soup is supposed to taste." She smiled despite herself. She folded the note and put it in the box and told herself she would handle Clement Hale. She went to town the next morning on the pretext of needing thread from the dry goods store, and she went prepared with the specific kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst version of something. Clement Hale was waiting for her outside the store. He was 30-something and had his brother's cold calculation without his brother's superficial charm, and he said her name with the particular possessiveness of a man who believes that information about a woman is the same as ownership of her. "Miss Ralston," he said, "my brother would like you to come home." "Austin is not my home," she said. He smiled in the way men smile when they have a trap prepared. "My sister-in-law is reconsidering her accusations. She'd like to speak with you before she does something that damages the family." Jane understood immediately. Frederica had not reconsidered anything. Clement had gotten to her, and now he needed Jane either returned or neutralized. Frederica could not proceed without Jane's testimony, and if Clement could convince Frederica that Jane had already recanted, or if he could convince the relevant parties in Austin that Jane's character was too compromised to be believed, he could collapse the entire thing. "Tell your brother," Jane said, keeping her voice even, "that I have nothing to say to him." "Miss Ralston." His voice changed. It became the voice of someone expressing a hidden motive without quite stating it. "You are 12 miles from town, working in a house with children and a man who doesn't know your full history. It would be a shame if he learned about it from sources that aren't friendly to you." There it was. The threat beneath the courtesy. If she did not comply, he would go to Daniel Donovan with a constructed version of her story, a version with enough truth to be believable and enough distortion to be damning. Jane held herself very still. "I will be at the Broken Spur for the foreseeable future," she said. "If you come there, I will not receive you." She walked back into the dry goods store and bought her thread with hands that she kept steady by an act of considerable will. And she did not let herself think about how badly this could go until she was in the buckboard heading back to the ranch. And then she let herself feel the full force of the danger, and she decided she would tell Daniel that evening. She did not tell Daniel that evening, because one of the cattle pasture fences had come down, and 3 head had wandered onto the neighboring property, and Daniel was out until dark dealing with it. And by the time he came in, she could see the exhaustion on him and could not find the right way to add one more weight. She told herself she would tell him tomorrow. Clement Hale did not wait for tomorrow. He arrived at the Broken Spur Ranch on a Saturday afternoon, while Daniel was in the far pasture, and Hector was at his own small house a 1/4 mile from the main house. He arrived in a rented buggy, and he came to the front door and knocked with the unhurried confidence of a man who believes he is in a position of power. Jane was in the kitchen with the children. She heard the knock and felt the quality of it, the specific presumption in the rhythm, and she told the children to stay at the kitchen table and walked to the front door and opened it. Clement Hale looked past her at the interior of the house. "May I come in?" "No," Jane said. He leaned slightly against the doorframe. "I've had a conversation with Mr. Prentice in town," he said, "and with several of the ladies here who were curious about the woman who answered an advertisement from a widower. I shared some information about your time in Austin, your dismissal, the nature of the circumstances." Jane felt the cold clarity of a forced choice. He had already moved, or he claimed he had. "What is it you want, Mr. Hale?" "A letter," he said, "signed by you, stating that your previous employer, Mr. Robert Hale, behaved toward you at all times with propriety, and that any contrary statements you may have made were made in error." She looked at him and understood the ultimate sacrifice he was asking her to make. Not just her position here, not just her reputation, but the truth. To sign that letter was to allow Robert Hale to continue. It was to betray Frederica, who had believed Jane and trusted her. It was to make herself a liar in permanent ink. "No," Jane said again. His expression did not change. "Then I will speak to Mr. Donovan directly." "I will speak to Mr. Donovan myself," said a voice from behind Clement Hale. Daniel was standing at the foot of the porch steps. He had come back from the far pasture early, and he had heard enough standing in the yard. Jane could see it in his face, the particular still quality that preceded his anger, which was not a loud or demonstrative anger but was very real and very solid. Clement Hale turned. The two men looked at each other. Daniel came up the porch steps and stood beside Jane, and the physical fact of him, tall and unhurried and immovable as limestone, was a presence that Clement Hale clearly had not accounted for. "You are on my property," Daniel said. "You have come to my home and spoken to a woman in my household in a way I find objectionable. I'd like you to leave." Clement gathered himself. "Mr. Donovan, I believe there are things about this woman that you should know before you." "I know what I need to know," Daniel said. His voice was completely quiet. "I know she is kind to my children and honest in her work, and that she has not given me a single reason to doubt her. Whatever happened in Austin is between her and whoever was responsible for it, and I have my own thoughts about which party that is." He looked at Clement Hale with the blue eyes that Jane had learned saw things clearly. "You have 30 seconds to start walking back to that buggy." Clement Hale was a man who operated best in situations where his power was hidden and his threat was implicit. Confronted with simple, physical certainty, he had less to work with. He looked at Jane. "Think carefully, Miss Ralston." "She has thought carefully," Daniel said. "Go." Clement Hale went. They stood on the porch and watched his buggy move down the road toward Cutter's Creek, and the afternoon was very still around them and Jane's hands were shaking. Daniel looked at her hands. He reached out and covered them with his own, the way you cover something fragile and real when you want to make it clear it is not alone, and Jane looked down at his hands over hers and felt something in her chest come completely undone. "Come inside," he said. "Tell me." And she did. She told him everything. Sitting at the kitchen table with the children mercifully occupied in the yard under Hector's eye, she told him about Robert Hale and the household in Austin, and the manner in which he had used his position, the way a man with power uses the fear of consequences as a tool, the way he had made her understand that her continued employment depended on her silence, and then made her silence impossible by making the situation worse. She told him about Frederica, who had believed her and had begun a legal process. She told him about leaving before the process was complete because she had not believed she could survive the exposure because she had been afraid and ashamed of being afraid, and that combination had sent her running. Daniel listened. He did not interrupt. He did not shift or look away. He listened the way a man listens when he is taking something seriously. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. "What Frederica Hale is doing," Jane said, "requires my testimony. Without it, his lawyers will dismantle her case." "Then you should give it," Daniel said. She looked at him. "I know it is not simple," he said. "I know it costs you something to go back and stand in front of those people and say the true thing. I know the ways a woman can be disbelieved and the damage that does." He paused. "But I think you know that silence is not something you can live with." She did know that. She had known it before she left Austin, and the knowing had not made the leaving easier. "If Clement Hale speaks to people in town," she said carefully, "and they believe his version, let them," Daniel said. "I am not governed by what Millicent Carver thinks, and anyone who matters already knows what I know." He held her gaze. "I will write to a lawyer in Austin. We can have your testimony taken properly, with documentation in a way that protects you." The word we landed between them like something definitive. Jane looked at the table. She had been running from this. She had been running from the exposure and the vulnerability and the requirement to be believed in public, and this man was sitting across from her and making it sound like something that could be faced, something with steps and a direction. "Why?" she said. "Why would you do that?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Because you are not alone here, Jane." She heard the first use of her name without the formal address, and the intimacy of it went through her like warmth. She said, "Daniel." He said nothing. He looked at her. And in the quiet of the kitchen, in the late afternoon light, with the sound of his children playing in the yard outside, something between them acknowledged itself for the first time. Not yet in words, not yet in action, but in the way they both sat still and let the moment be what it was. In the following days, Daniel was as good as his word. He wrote to a lawyer in Austin named Mr. James Whitmore, a man he had known through business dealings, who had a reputation for handling difficult domestic cases with integrity. The letter explained the situation clearly without exposing Jane to anyone who would use the information against her, and Mr. Whitmore's response, which arrived within the fortnight, outlined a process by which Jane's testimony could be submitted in writing and notarized, with the additional supporting documentation that would make it significantly harder to dismiss. The process took several weeks. During those weeks, Jane and Daniel wrote and revised the testimony together at the kitchen table in the evenings, after the children were in bed, and in the particular intimacy of that work, of choosing the right words for the true thing, they learned each other in a new way. He was meticulous and careful, the same way he was meticulous and careful about everything in his domain. He asked questions with precision and listened to the answers with full attention. He did not flinch at the difficult parts of the story. He treated the whole thing as what it was, something real that had happened to a real person who deserved to have the account of it taken seriously. Somewhere in the third evening of this work, Jane looked up from the papers and found him looking at her, and she did not look away. Neither did he. "You are good at this," she said, "at listening." "My father was not," he said simply. "I decided I would be different." She thought about what kind of man decides that and then becomes it. "Your children are fortunate," she said. Something moved in his face. "I am not always what I mean to be," he said. "This last year," he stopped. "I know," she said quietly. "Grief makes it harder." He looked at her. "You have grieved too," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said, "not the same grief, not the same shape." But the loss of Austin, of the life she had expected to have, of the safety she had thought she was building, had its own weight. "Does it get better?" he asked. She heard the real question underneath it, the one a father asks about the particular grief of his children watching him struggle. "It changes," she said. "It becomes something you can carry rather than something that carries you." He held her gaze for a long moment and then looked back down at the papers, and Jane went back to her own work, and neither of them said anything more that evening. But when she went upstairs, she found Eliza's note on her pillow, and it said, "I am glad you are here because Papa smiled at supper tonight." Jane held that note for a long time and thought about what it meant to be the reason a man's face changed. The letter and testimony were sent to Mr. Whitmore in Austin in the last week of May, and then there was a waiting period of uncertain length, and life on the Broken Spur continued with its own rhythms. June arrived like a furnace door opening. The Texas heat was something Jane had not fully anticipated, the particular absoluteness of it, the way it pressed down from noon until evening with remorseless uniformity. The ranch adapted its schedule around it. Early mornings for heavy work, a long, slow midday, activity again in the cool of late afternoon. In the evenings, the family often sat on the porch after supper to catch whatever breeze existed, and Jane began to sit with them as a matter of course. The children played in the yard until dark. Eliza usually ended up beside Jane on the porch bench, and Daniel usually sat in the chair at the end of the porch, and they talked about whatever was in front of them. The weather, the cattle prices, the progress of the vegetable garden, a story Thomas had heard from the schoolteacher about a man who had once ridden a horse from Texas to California. These conversations were comfortable and ordinary, and Jane treasured them with a fierceness she was careful not to show. One evening in mid-June, Thomas asked her where she came from, and she told him a version of her history that was true in its broad shapes. She had grown up in the hill country of central Texas. She had been educated at a school for young women in San Antonio. She had worked as a teacher and governess in Austin. Thomas asked if she had a family, and she said her parents had both died when she was 20, her father of a fever and her mother of grief, 2 years apart, and there were no brothers or sisters. Daniel was listening to this from his end of the porch, and she felt his attention even when she was looking at Thomas. "So we are your family now," Thomas said, with the direct simplicity of a 9-year-old, and Clara said Thomas in a tone of someone who has learned adults find such things embarrassing, and Eliza beside Jane did not say anything but moved a small millimeter increment closer. Jane said, with her voice very steady, "You are very kind to say so." She did not look at Daniel, but she heard clearly the sound of him setting down his glass. Later that night, after the children were in bed, she was in the kitchen making a cup of tea when she heard him on the stairs and then in the doorway, and she kept her back to him and poured the hot water and waited. "Thomas did not mean to make you uncomfortable," he said. "He didn't," she said. She turned around. "He is an honest boy. He says what he sees." Daniel leaned against the doorframe and looked at her across the kitchen. In the lamplight his face had the quality it sometimes had in the evenings, less guarded than in the daytime, more willing to let her see the real substance of him. "What he sees is what I see," Daniel said. The sentence lay between them. Jane set down her cup. Her heart was beating with careful, urgent precision. "Daniel," she said, "I am your governess." "I know what you are," he said, "and I know what you have become." He paused. "I am not asking you to be anything. I'm only telling you what is true." She looked at him for a long moment. "What is true?" "That I think about you constantly," he said. "That I have thought about you since the first week you were here, and I am tired of pretending I do not. That when I come in from the field in the evenings, the thing I am most looking forward to is the sound of your voice." He held her gaze. "I know that is not a simple thing to say, given the arrangement. I know you came here for work and safety and not for—" He stopped. "Not for what?" she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "Not for someone with a grief he is still learning to carry, and 3 children who need a great deal in land that is 12 miles from everything." He looked at her directly. "I am not an easy offer, Jane." She understood in that moment how long he had been holding this, how carefully he had been managing it, how much he had been protecting her from his own feelings out of respect for what she had come here to escape. She walked across the kitchen and stood in front of him, and she looked up at him with the full directness that people sometimes called cold when they didn't understand it, and she said, "I have not been afraid of difficult things." He looked at her for a long-held moment. Then he reached out and touched her face, the back of one hand along her cheekbone, the way you touch something you have wanted to touch for a long time and are now carefully ascertaining is real. And Jane leaned very slightly into his hand, and that was the beginning of everything. He did not kiss her that night. He was not that kind of man, the kind who moves faster than the moment allows. He stepped back and looked at her with something in his eyes that was clear and warm and patient, and he said good night, and she said good night, and she went upstairs with her tea and sat in the east window and looked at the dark hills, and felt like someone who has been standing in a cold field for a very long time and has just stepped inside. The next morning he was at breakfast before her, which was unusual, and when she came into the kitchen he looked up from his coffee and their eyes met, and she felt the warmth of it bloom across her chest. And then Thomas came down the stairs demanding to know if there was any bacon, and the morning went on the way mornings do. They were careful with each other over the following weeks, moving into something new with the particular carefulness of 2 people who have both been hurt and do not want to damage what they are building. There were no more prolonged kitchen conversations, not at first, because neither of them trusted the evenings entirely. But there were small things. The way he would come and stand beside her when she was at the vegetable garden and tell her what was doing well and what needed attention, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm. The way she would bring him coffee to the barn without being asked, and he would look at her over the rim of the cup with that blue gaze that was becoming familiar and dangerous to her in equal measure. The way they both began to linger a few minutes longer than necessary at the end of the day, neither wanting to be the one who ended it. In July, a letter arrived from Mr. Whitmore in Austin. The testimony had been entered into the formal record. Frederica Hale had held her ground. 2 other women who had worked in the Hale household had come forward with their own accounts, evidence of a pattern that Robert Hale's lawyers could not easily dismiss. The matter was proceeding toward a legal resolution. Daniel read the letter at the breakfast table, and then he passed it to Jane, and she read it twice, and then she sat very still with it in her hands and felt the particular relief of something dark finally beginning to be resolved. The secrets had been spoken. The hidden history had been given to the light. The trap had been dismantled. She looked up and found all three children watching her with the specific alertness of children who know something important is happening without knowing what it is. She said, "Good news." Eliza's note that night said, "I am glad you are here because today your face looked like someone who put something down." Jane laughed alone in her room, a real laugh, the kind that comes up without announcement, and she held the note against her chest and thought about how a 5-year-old saw more clearly than most adults she had ever known. After the letter from Mr. Whitmore, something in Jane shifted. The dark past that she had been carrying, the fear of exposure, the weight of the forced choice she had made in leaving Austin, these things did not disappear, but they lost their power to shape her behavior. She was no longer poised for flight. She was no longer treating the Broken Spur as a temporary shelter. She began to plant more in the vegetable garden. This was not symbolic, or not only symbolic. The garden was practical and the growing season was the right length, and there were things she wanted to try growing, tomatoes and squash, and a row of sunflowers along the south fence that she had been thinking about since May. But she was aware, as she planted, that she was making an investment in a future here, and the awareness was not uncomfortable. Daniel saw her planting the sunflowers. He came to stand at the garden fence in the late afternoon and looked at the row she was putting in and said, "Those will be tall come September." "I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Planning to be here in September," he said. It was not precisely a question. She looked up at him from her knees in the dirt. "Planning to be here considerably longer than September," she said. Something moved in his face. A slow, careful warmth. The smile he had that was not a wide smile but was completely real. "Good," he said, and went back to the barn. She planted the rest of the row with her heart moving in a way that was entirely undignified and entirely welcome. The courtship of Jane Ralston and Daniel Donovan was not a courtship in the formal sense that 1882 Texas would have recognized. There were no calling cards and no chaperones and no careful parlor visits. It was instead a daily, accumulating intimacy, a series of small, true moments that each added themselves to the growing structure of something permanent. There was the Sunday afternoon in August when he taught her to ride the ranch's steadiest horse, a gray mare named Dove, and Jane was less capable than she had represented herself in her initial letters, and he was patiently amused about it, and the laughter between them that afternoon was the easiest and most unguarded she had felt in years. There was the evening when Clara came to her crying because a girl at the Cutter's Creek schoolhouse had said something unkind, and Jane held her and talked her through it with the directness and warmth she was discovering she had more of than she had believed. And Daniel stood in the hallway outside the room and listened. And when Jane came out, he looked at her with the expression that made it very hard for her to keep her equanimity. There was the morning she found him awake before dawn, sitting on the porch with his coffee, and she came and sat beside him with her own cup, and they watched the Texas sunrise together without speaking, the sky going from black to indigo to a violet rose that was extravagant and private. And it was one of those moments that both of them knew, as it was happening, that they would remember for the rest of their lives. There was the evening he showed her the letters his wife had written, not all of them but some, and told her about Margaret Donovan, who had been funny and pragmatic, and had died of a fever that had come on suddenly and been over too quickly, who had loved Eliza with a particular fierceness, because Eliza had been the hardest of the births, who had made Daniel promise in the last days to be happy again. Jane listened to this with everything she had. She did not offer comfort that was smaller than the truth warranted. She said, "She sounds like someone I would have liked." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "She would have liked you," he said. "She had no patience for pretense." Jane heard the compliment in this and held it carefully. And through all of this, every night without fail, Eliza's notes continued. "I am glad you are here because you let me sit on the porch when I cannot sleep. I am glad you are here because you know how to fix the pump. I am glad you are here because you never pretend not to be sad when you are sad. I am glad you are here because Thomas said you told him he was brave when he was scared of the horse, and Thomas is better since. I am glad you are here because I think Papa is better since." That last note Jane held for a long time. She thought about what a 5-year-old understands about her father's grief and the change in it. She thought about what Eliza had been doing with these notes from the very beginning, whether the child had understood it consciously or not. One small thing every night, building an argument for Jane's presence, for her worth, for her place in this household. She was not sure if Eliza was trying to convince Jane or to give Jane the proof she needed for her own arguments with herself. Perhaps both. Perhaps a 5-year-old with wide brown eyes and her father's capacity for silence had understood, from very early, that Jane Ralston needed to hear, repeatedly and specifically, that she was wanted. In September, the sunflowers came up along the south fence, tall and extravagant and completely indifferent to any human drama, and the children were delighted by them. And Daniel stood at the garden fence and looked at them for a long moment and then looked at Jane and said, "You were right about those." "I usually am," she said. He laughed. She had been collecting his laughs since the summer, the real ones, which were rare and quiet and went deep, and she felt each one as a gift. On the first Saturday of September, after supper, after the children were in bed, Daniel Donovan came to the kitchen where Jane was tidying the table, and he stood behind her and said her name in a way that was different from all the previous ways he had said it. She turned around. He was holding a small box, the kind jewelers used, and he was looking at her with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is going to be honest about it regardless of how it lands. "I know this is not the conventional order of things," he said. "I know you came here as a governess, and I know what happened in Austin made things complicated, and I know you have reasons to be careful about what you trust." He paused. "I know I am asking you to take on something that is a great deal, this land, this household, 3 children who are still learning what they have lost and what they still have." He held her gaze. "I love you, Jane. I have loved you since March, and I have been trying to be careful about it, to give you space to decide your own mind. But I find I can't be careful about it anymore." Jane looked at him, at his blue eyes and his scarred hands and his careful, honest face. At the man who had stood on his own porch and told Clement Hale to leave. At the man who had sat across a kitchen table and listened to the worst of her history without flinching. At the man who came in from the field every evening and looked first for her and smiled in the way that was quiet and real. She said, "I love you, Daniel. I have loved you for a considerable time, and I have been telling myself not to." Something enormous shifted in his face. The careful tension, the protective restraint he had maintained for months, it went out of him all at once, and what was left was something open and completely real and profoundly happy. He opened the box. The ring inside was a simple gold band with a small blue stone, modest and beautiful. He held it out to her. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Will you be here, not as governess, as mine, as theirs?" Jane looked at the ring and then at his face and felt the full weight of what she was saying yes to. The land and the work and the 3 children and the grief that was still healing and the happiness that was also real and growing. She felt the weight of it, and it did not frighten her. "Yes," she said. "Yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, and then he drew her toward him and kissed her, really kissed her for the first time. And it was the kind of kiss that is both an ending and a beginning, the kind that settles something and opens something at the same time. When they separated, slightly breathless, her forehead against his jaw, she heard a sound on the stairs. They both looked up. Eliza was standing on the 3rd stair in her nightgown, with both hands pressed over her mouth, looking at them with an expression of such pure, transparent joy that it was nearly impossible to look at. "Eliza," Daniel said in his father voice. Eliza turned and ran back up the stairs. They could hear her small feet on the floorboards above, and then the sound of Thomas's door opening, and Eliza's voice, high and urgent, telling her brother something, and then two voices, and then a third as Clara apparently woke up. Jane began to laugh. Daniel looked at her, and then he began to laugh too, and they stood in the kitchen laughing at the sound of their household, erupting into celebration upstairs, and it was one of the best moments of Jane's life. Thomas and Clara came downstairs first, Thomas with the self-conscious wonder of a boy being asked to absorb a large piece of information, Clara with the rag doll under one arm and the expression of someone who is going to need some time to process. And then Eliza, who came down last and walked directly to Jane and put both her arms around Jane's waist and pressed her face against Jane's side and held on. Jane put her hand on the child's dark head and looked at Daniel over Eliza's shoulder, and his face, in that moment, was the face of someone who has found his way back to something he had not been sure he could find again. They were married in October at the small Methodist church in Cutter's Creek on a cool, clear morning when the mesquite trees were turning gold at the edges, and the sky was the deep autumn blue of Texas at its most beautiful. Millicent Carver was not invited. Mr. Prentice was. Hector stood beside Daniel as witness, having accepted this role with the quiet dignity he brought to everything. A woman from Cutter's Creek named Mrs. Alvarez, who ran the schoolhouse and had become Jane's first real friend in town, stood beside Jane. The children sat in the first row with their best clothes and their varying degrees of composure, Thomas solemn and straight, Clara twisting the ribbon on her dress, Eliza sitting completely still with her hands in her lap, watching everything with those wide brown eyes. The ceremony was brief and real. The vows were the traditional ones, and Jane said them with her whole voice, looking at Daniel's face, and felt the truth of each word as she said it. Afterward, there was a small celebration at the ranch, with food and the neighbors who had proven themselves worth knowing, and music from a fiddle player named McCormick who knew every dance tune in the hill country repertoire. Jane danced with Thomas, who was deeply uncomfortable about it and deeply proud at the same time. She danced with Hector, who was surprisingly graceful. She danced, finally, with Daniel, and the feeling of being in his arms in front of all these people, publicly and permanently his, was something she had not let herself want for so long that feeling it was almost overwhelming. He leaned close and said quietly in her ear, "Happy." She pulled back enough to look at him. "Extraordinarily," she said. His smile, the real one, quiet and deep, was the most beautiful thing she had seen. That night, after the guests had gone and the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Jane sat at her writing desk in the room that was now their room, and she took out the wooden box that had traveled with her from Austin, and she opened it. The notes were all there. Dozens of them now, accumulated over months, each one folded carefully, each one a small, specific, true thing. She held them and thought about all that they added up to, the slow building of trust, the patient, faithful argument a 5-year-old had made for Jane's place in this household, for Jane's presence in this life. Daniel came and stood behind her and looked at the box of notes. "Eliza," he said. "Yes," Jane said. "Every night since her 3rd night here she left one on my pillow." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up one of the folded notes and opened it carefully. He read it and she watched something move through his face, something soft and large. "I did not know she was doing this," he said. "I know," Jane said. "I thought it was hers, private between us." He set the note down gently. "Can I read them?" She looked at him. "All of them." "All of them," he said. She held the box out to him and he sat on the edge of the bed and began to read through them, one by one slowly, and she watched his face, and she saw him understand what his youngest child had been doing all these months, the steadfast, nightly work of gratitude and faith and invitation. When he got to the note that said, "I am glad you are here because I think Papa is better since," he stopped reading for a moment and sat very still. "She is extraordinary," he said. "She is," Jane agreed. He looked at Jane. "She chose you before I did." "She chose me first," Jane said. "And more thoroughly." He set the last note in the box and came to sit beside her at the desk. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they sat together in the lamplight. And the house around them was full of the particular piece of a place where everyone in it is accounted for. In the morning, Eliza came to their room at dawn with her deliberate, soundless feet, and she stopped in the doorway when she saw that both of them were awake, and she stood there in her nightgown with her hands clasped behind her back in the stance Jane had first seen on the porch the day she arrived. Jane said, "Good morning, Eliza." Eliza came to the bed and climbed up and settled between them with the confidence of someone who has been planning to do this for some time. Daniel looked at Jane over the top of Eliza's dark head, and his expression was the open, unguarded one she had come to love more than she could easily say. The autumn moved into winter, and the Broken Spur settled into the rhythms of its changed life. Thomas, who had watched Jane arrive with the wariness of a boy who had learned that new people could leave, had come fully into his trust of her by October, and by December, he was showing her things with the proprietorial pride of someone who has decided you belong to the same place he does. The best spot on the north pasture where you could sometimes see deer at dusk, the cedar post that had been carved with initials by some previous owner, the particular quality of the dawn on a morning when frost had come in the night. Clara had taken her own path, which was thornier and more interesting. She had her father's observation and her own considerable will, and she had spent months looking for the place where Jane was false, because Clara understood at 7 that new people sometimes presented one face and revealed another, and she was not going to be caught by that. When she failed to find the false face, she spent another few weeks being somewhat suspicious of the consistency of it, and then she arrived at trust the way Clara arrived at most things, abruptly and completely and without announcing it. She came to Jane one evening in November and asked her to teach her to braid her own hair properly. It was, for Clara, the equivalent of a declaration. Jane taught her. They sat at the mirror and Jane's hands worked through Clara's dark hair and Clara watched in the glass with full attention, and Jane thought about how each of these children was teaching her something about what it meant to be genuinely present in a life. Eliza continued her notes. They were different now. They still said, "I am glad you are here because," but the things that followed had shifted in tenor. Less about relief, less about the specific fear that Jane might leave. More about daily pleasure, about things noticed and appreciated, about a world that was, for a 5-year-old turning 6, expanding steadily. "I am glad you are here because you showed me how to press flowers. I am glad you are here because you are learning the names of the birds. I am glad you are here because when you and Papa argue about the best way to fix the gate, I know you will both be laughing about it later. I am glad you are here because I think we are a family now." Jane left that last note on Daniel's pillow one morning, tucked under his book. He found it when he came in from the morning work. He came to find her in the garden and he held it up and she raised an eyebrow and he looked at her with that quiet, real smile and said, "I think she's right." "She usually is," Jane said. He kissed her there in the garden in the late morning light, and Hector very diplomatically walked around the other side of the barn. Winter passed, and with it came the news from Austin that Jane had been waiting for with a patient tension she managed as best she could. Mr. Whitmore's letter arrived in late January of 1883. The case against Robert Hale had been decided in Frederica's favor. The documentation was thorough, the pattern undeniable, the testimonies including Jane's decisive. Robert Hale had been required to make a financial settlement and to leave Austin, and the Hale household was dissolved, and Frederica was in good health and had sent her own letter enclosed, which expressed a gratitude so deep and genuine that Jane had to put it down twice before she could finish reading it. The last of it was over. The dark past had been settled. The betrayal had been named and accounted for. The forced choice she had made in leaving, which had cost her such guilt, had been redeemed by the testimony she had given from the safety of the Broken Spur, and the woman it had helped most was free and well. Jane sat in the kitchen with both letters and let herself feel the completeness of it. Daniel came in and she looked at him, and he saw it in her face immediately and crossed the kitchen to her, and she told him, and he held her, and the weight of a year and a half of carrying this finally, fully, set itself down. Spring came again in 1883, the first full spring of their marriage, and with it came the discovery that Jane was expecting a child. She told Daniel on a March morning, sitting on the porch with their coffee, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before. It was the expression of someone absorbing a piece of good news so complete that it requires a moment to come fully real. He took both her hands in his and held them and looked at her with the blue eyes that had become the most familiar and beloved sight she knew. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you?" "I am very well," she said, "and very happy." He brought her hands to his mouth and pressed a kiss to the back of each one, and she felt the trembling in his breath that he was too careful to let show in his face. The children were told at supper. Thomas received the news with the studied calm he had deployed at the storm and subsequently dropped. His face broke into a grin that was entirely his own. Clara said, with the authority of a 7-year-old who had been thinking about this, "I hope it is a girl." Then she reconsidered and said, "Actually, I do not mind." Eliza said nothing, but she looked at Jane across the table with an expression of such complete, incandescent satisfaction that Jane had to look down at her plate to keep her composure. That night Eliza's note said, "I am glad you are here because now you will be here always." Jane held that note for a long time. The pregnancy proceeded well through the spring and summer. Jane was strong and practical about it, the way she was practical about most things, and the ranch adapted its rhythms around her, though she resisted the adaptations more than she should have, and Daniel developed a careful habit of watching her from across the yard in the way of a man who has learned that direct interference is unwelcome, but who is not willing to stop paying attention. She continued to teach the children. She continued to work in the garden. She continued to sit on the porch in the evenings and watch the Texas sky go through its extravagant performances. The sunflowers came back in September because she had saved the seeds from the previous year, and the children counted them with the proprietorial delight of people who had been part of making something real. In November of 1883, on a cold, clear morning when the frost had come in the night and the grass was silver at the roots, Jane Donovan gave birth to a son. The birth was attended by the midwife from Cutter's Creek, a capable woman named Mrs. Garrett who had delivered half the population of that county without incident, and Daniel, who had asked to be present and had held Jane's hand through the long hours of it without saying a word more than was wanted. The boy came in the early morning, strong and loud, and Daniel held him with the careful reverence of a man who has held babies before and still finds the weight of a new life almost too large to believe. Thomas chose the name. He had been campaigning for weeks. William, after a historical figure he admired from a book Jane had given him for his birthday. Daniel and Jane looked at each other and agreed, and William Donovan entered the record of Cutter's Creek in November 1883. Eliza's note that night, left on Jane's pillow in the bedroom where she was resting with the new baby. "I am glad you are here because you gave us William." Jane read it through tears and held Eliza's hand when the child came to sit beside her on the bed and looked at her new brother with the same calm, evaluating regard she had once given Jane herself, and apparently reached the same conclusion because she nodded once and said, "He has Papa's ears." "He does," Jane agreed. "That is fine," Eliza said. "Papa's ears are a good shape." The years that followed were good years. They were not without difficulty, because land and children and weather and time ensure difficulty as a matter of course, and the Broken Spur had its share of hard seasons. There was a dry year in 1884 when the cattle pasture went brown, and the well dropped low and they lived lean for months. And Daniel moved through that year with the focused determination of a man who has survived hard things and knows how to outlast them. There was a fever that came through in 1885 that knocked Thomas down for 2 weeks and frightened everyone considerably. But he came through it whole and stronger, and Jane sat with him through the worst of it without sleeping more than fitfully, and felt, through those long nights, the full force of how entirely she had become a mother to these children. Clara, at 10, 11, 12, was becoming her own particular person, sharp and artistic and increasingly interested in the world beyond Cutter's Creek. Jane fed this interest with books and conversation, and the kind of engagement that told Clara her intelligence was not only acceptable but valued. Between them there had developed a friendship that was both maternal and intellectual, the relationship of two women who happen to be separated in age by 19 years but are genuinely interested in each other. Thomas grew into the land with a naturalness that delighted his father. By 14 he was working the ranch in earnest, not because he had to, but because he wanted to, and the quality of Daniel's relationship with his son, as the boy grew into someone Daniel could talk to as well as parent, was one of the most consistently beautiful things Jane witnessed in those years. And Eliza Donovan, who had started it all with her small feet and her careful handwriting and her nightly argument for Jane's presence in her life, grew up in the particular way that very perceptive people grow up, with a deepening rather than a changing. What had been in her at 5 was still in her at 10, and at 15, the capacity for precise attention, for genuine feeling expressed in specific and honest language, for the kind of love that does not make itself loud but is entirely constant. She stopped leaving notes when she was 9, not because she had stopped feeling the things she had written, but because by then she knew, with the certainty of someone who has read a situation correctly from the beginning, that Jane was there and would remain there, and the argument she had been making with the notes had long since been decided. Jane kept every note in the wooden box. She had explained to Daniel once, late in the first year of their marriage, what the notes had meant to her in those early months, not just the warmth of them, not just Eliza's particular faithful love, but what they had done for Jane's understanding of her own worth. Every night one small, specific, true thing. You smell like violets. You read the words right. You made the soup taste the way soup is supposed to taste. She was telling me I was real, Jane had said. That my presence here was real and mattered in real ways, not in the abstract, in the specific. She had looked at Daniel. I needed that very much, and I did not know I needed it. Daniel had held her face in his hands and looked at her with the direct, quiet love that was the most familiar and sustaining thing in her life. You are very real, he had said. Everything about you is real, including the part that needed telling. In 1886, Jane gave birth to their second child, a daughter this time, born in April when the bluebonnets were going across the fields in their extravagant blue sheets. They named her Margaret, after Daniel's first wife, and the naming was Jane's suggestion, made with the simple conviction that the woman who had built this household and given it its children deserved to be remembered in the most direct way possible. Daniel had been very still when she suggested it. Then he had kissed her with a tenderness that encompassed a great deal. Margaret Donovan was a lively, loud, demonstrably affectionate person from approximately her 4th month, and the older children adored her with varying expressions. Thomas's careful, responsible affection, Clara's delight in having someone new to teach things to, William's possessive pride in his sister, and Eliza's quiet, total devotion. The household was full in 1886. It was full of people and noise and the specific organized chaos of a large family on working land, and Jane stood sometimes in the middle of it, in the kitchen, or on the porch, or in the garden, and felt the completeness of it move through her like warmth. She had come to a door in the spring of 1882 with one leather trunk and the wreckage of a previous life, and the determined conviction that she would be useful here without needing anything. She had been wrong about the not needing. She had needed something, something she had not known how to name, and a 5-year-old with dark hair and brown eyes and a piece of paper and a careful pencil had named it for her, one small thing at a time. I am glad you are here, because you are here, because your presence matters in ways I can see and count and name, because you are real and the things you do are real, and the ways you change this place are real and visible and worth noting. Jane Ralston, who had become Jane Donovan, who had planted sunflowers along the south fence and testified against a man who deserved it, and fallen in love with a rancher who listened and married him in an October church, and raised 4 children on hard, beautiful Texas land, sat on the porch of the Broken Spur one evening in the autumn of 1886 with her husband beside her and her infant daughter in her arms and her other children making various noises in the yard below. And she was entirely, specifically, carefully happy. Daniel sat close enough that his arm was against hers, and he held his coffee cup and watched the flat country go gold in the evening light, and after a while he said, in the quiet voice that still reached some fundamental place in her, "What are you thinking about?" She looked at him. At the blue eyes and the gray at his temples and the hands that were still scarred from honest work, and the face that she had been watching for 4 years learn to carry joy again alongside its grief. "I was thinking about the first note," she said. He looked at her. "Eliza's first note," she said. "It said I was glad you are here because you smell like violets." He smiled, the slow, real one. "Do you still smell like violets?" he said. "I very much doubt it," Jane said. "I have been in the garden all morning and the baby has been sick on my shoulder." He laughed, the quiet, deep laugh she had been collecting for years, and she felt it in her chest the same way she had felt it the first time. "I am glad you are here," he said, not quoting, saying. She looked at him for a long moment. The children's voices rose and fell in the yard. The sky over the East Hills was going pink at the edges, the beginning of the extravagant Texas sunset that she had been watching from this porch for 4 years and still found newly beautiful. "I know," she said. "I know you are." She leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and the baby made a small sound between sleeping and waking, and the evening settled over the Broken Spur Ranch like something that had been finding its way here for a long time and had finally, fully, arrived. Inside the house, Eliza was at the kitchen table doing her lessons. She was 9 now, and her handwriting had grown into itself. No longer the crooked, careful print of a 5-year-old, but the clear, deliberate hand of someone who had always taken language seriously. She was working on her arithmetic, but she had a piece of paper beside her arithmetic book, and when the numbers were done, she folded the paper with 4 precise creases and carried it upstairs to the room at the end of the hall, the room that had once belonged only to her father and was now her father's and Jane's, and she set it on Jane's pillow and then went back downstairs to finish her evening bread and milk. Jane found it when she came up to settle Margaret for the night. She unfolded it. She read it. She stood in the middle of the bedroom she shared with Daniel Donovan, and she held the note her youngest had left, and the note said, in Eliza's clear, deliberate hand, "I am glad you are here because everything that is good about our home has you in the middle of it." Jane looked at the note for a long time. Then she folded it with 4 careful creases and put it in the wooden box that had traveled with her from Austin, the box that held dozens of them now, the box that held the whole patient, faithful record of one child's love for a woman who had needed to be told, in small and specific terms, that her presence was real and wanted and worth staying for. She put the box back on the shelf and picked up her sleeping daughter and stood at the east window and looked out at the dark hills and the enormous Texas sky full of stars. And she thought about the spring morning in 1882 when the stagecoach had left her at the junction in Cutter's Creek, and the town had looked at her with sharp-toothed curiosity, and she had ridden out 12 miles to a ranch where a man and 3 children needed something she had not known she was carrying. She had needed them just as much. More, perhaps, because she had arrived empty of certainty, emptied by betrayal and running and the accumulated weight of a past full of forced choices and hidden fears, and a loneliness so practiced she had mistaken it for self-sufficiency. And one by one, night after night, in the small specific language of a child who saw clearly and loved without reservation, Eliza had filled it back up. Daniel appeared in the doorway, and she turned and he saw her face, and he crossed the room and took the sleeping baby from her with one arm and pulled her close with the other, and she put her face against his chest and felt his heartbeat, steady and known, and the house around them was full of the sounds of their children settling into sleep, and the land outside was immense and dark and theirs, and everything that had led her here, everything she had lost and run from and been afraid of, had been exactly the road this life required. She was here, she was glad, she was finally and completely and without reservation home.